It was a cold, blustery afternoon when the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the country found himself stepping out of his sleek, black car and onto the busy city street. He was used to power lunches, board meetings, and managing millions. But nothing in his high-profile life could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him just beyond the corner. A small child, no older than 5 or 6, sat huddled on the curb. The child's clothes were torn, their face streaked with tears. They held a crumpled piece of paper in their small hands, and their eyes were wide, filled with fear. The bustling crowd seemed to ignore the child, walking by as if they were just another face in the crowd. The CEO's first instinct was to walk past. He had a meeting to get to, important people waiting. But something in the child's desperate eyes made his feet slow. He stopped, his heart clenching in his chest. He wasn't a man who dealt with situations like this, but something about this moment felt different. He crouched down to the child's level, his voice soft but firm. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. The child looked up, startled. They didn't say anything at first, just shook their head and continued to cry. The CEO felt a pang of frustration. Time was slipping away, but the child was in clear distress. He couldn't just leave. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, scanning the street for anyone who might be looking for the child. The child didn't answer right away, instead pointing at the piece of paper in their hand. With trembling fingers, they handed it to him. The CEO took it, glancing down at the message scrawled in messy handwriting, "Please take care of me. I have nowhere to go." His heart sank. This wasn't just a lost child, it was a cry for help. "Where's your home?" the CEO asked, kneeling beside them. The child hesitated for a moment, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then, in a tiny voice, they whispered, "I don't have one." The weight of those words hit him like a punch to the gut. There were so many children out there with broken homes, discarded by the system or left behind by circumstances beyond their control. But this child had no safety net, no place to run, no one to turn to. The CEO looked around again, his mind racing. He wasn't just some stranger passing by, he was the CEO of a powerful company, someone who could make things happen. But could he help this child? Could he do what was needed to make sure they weren't left to wander the streets, alone and afraid? He reached out, offering his hand to the child. "Come with me. We'll figure this out. I promise." The child stared at his outstretched hand, unsure. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the small hand hesitantly grasped his. A spark of trust. Just a flicker, but it was enough. And as the CEO helped the child to their feet, a sense of unease filled him. Something about this situation didn't feel right. He didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter would soon reveal a shocking secret, one that would turn his world upside down and reveal a hidden connection between him and this frightened child. But for now, the child's tear-streaked face was enough to make him forget everything else. Whatever the secret was, it could wait. Right now, he had to make sure this child was safe. The CEO's car sped through the busy streets, the child sitting quietly beside him. He kept stealing glances at the small figure in the seat next to him, still unsure of what to do. There was a strange heaviness in the air, something beyond just a child needing help. The child had barely said a word since they left the street, and every moment of silence made the CEO more uneasy. He could tell the child was exhausted. Their eyes were swollen from crying, their clothes tattered from days, maybe weeks, of neglect. They kept looking out the window, seemingly lost in their own world, avoiding eye contact with him. And yet, the CEO could sense that there was more to this situation than the simple, innocent cry for help he had first assumed. The child was hiding something, a secret that was just out of reach. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, trying to break the silence. His voice was warm, calm, but the child didn't respond. Instead, they shifted in their seat and clutched the crumpled piece of paper tightly, as if it were a lifeline. The CEO wondered what the message on that paper meant. Who had written it? Where had the child come from? The questions kept swirling in his mind, but he knew the child needed time. He would give them that. After a few more minutes of driving, the CEO made the decision to take the child to his office. He figured it was safer than taking them home. His home was full of staff, security, and company executives, all of whom would be far too curious about the child's sudden appearance. He couldn't afford to have his private life exposed, not when he was in the middle of critical negotiations. As the car turned into the parking garage, the child's eyes flickered with apprehension. He glanced at them, concerned. "You're safe here. I promise," he said, trying to offer comfort. They looked at him for a long moment, then finally nodded, though their expression remained distant. When they reached the CEO's private office, he had his assistant bring over a small plate of food, hoping to ease the child's hunger. It had been a while since they had spoken. The child simply stared at the plate, their fingers trembling, but they didn't touch it. "What's your name?" the CEO asked gently. The child looked up at him, their face a mixture of confusion and fear. They didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long silence, they mumbled, "I don't want to say." The CEO could feel the wall the child had built. They didn't trust him yet. He could only imagine what kind of life they must have had for such wariness to run so deep at such a young age. "Why don't you want to say your name?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." The child hesitated, and for a moment, the CEO thought they might break down in tears again. Instead, they sat up straighter and wiped their eyes with the back of their hand. I'm not supposed to be here," they whispered. "I'm running away." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The CEO's heart clenched. Running away? From what? He leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in thought. "Why are you running away? You don't have to be afraid anymore." But the child wasn't ready to open up. They looked down at their feet, avoiding his gaze. "I can't tell you," they said, barely audible. He wasn't about to push. The child had already been through too much. But the truth was, the CEO was getting more and more worried. The vague answers only deepened the mystery. What had they been running from? A neglectful parent? An abusive situation? His mind raced with possibilities. He had to know more, but he didn't want to make the child feel cornered. He'd give them time. But the unanswered questions, those would keep him awake at night. Why had the child been abandoned in the street? What was so dangerous about their situation that they'd risk everything to run? In the back of his mind, the CEO could already sense that this was no ordinary case of neglect. There was something else at play. Something larger. He felt it in his gut. And then, just as he was about to ask more, the child's eyes darted to the door, and they stiffened. The CEO looked toward the door, confused. Had someone followed them? But before he could ask, the child stood abruptly, grabbing the crumpled piece of paper again and clutching it to their chest. "I have to go," the child said, their voice trembling. "They'll find me here." The CEO's mind raced as the child bolted for the door. He moved quickly to stop them, but in that instant, a knock echoed on the door. Someone had arrived. Someone who might know more than the child was willing to reveal. The CEO hesitated, unsure of what was going on, but as he opened the door, his entire world would shift. The door swung open, and in walked one of the CEO's trusted executives, Carl. He paused mid-step when he saw the child, confusion crossing his face. "Sir, is everything all right?" Carl asked, his gaze flicking between the CEO and the child. Before the CEO could respond, the child took a step back, their eyes wide with panic. The piece of paper in their hand crumpled even tighter as they darted a quick glance at the door. "Who's that?" the child asked, their voice barely above a whisper, their body tense like a coiled spring. The CEO didn't want to alarm the child any further, but Carl's presence added an unexpected layer of complexity to the situation. His gaze softened as he turned to the child. "This is Carl. He's someone I trust," the CEO said calmly, trying to reassure both the child and himself. Carl, sensing the tension, immediately took a step back and gave the child a polite nod. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." But the child wasn't convinced. Their body stiffened, eyes darting toward the door once again. It was as though they could feel danger lurking just outside the room. The CEO could see the fear in their eyes and knew he had to act quickly before they bolted. Hey, the CEO said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. But we need to figure out what's going on, okay?" The child looked down at the paper in their hand, then at the CEO, their eyes filled with unshed tears. For a moment, the room was thick with silence. Carl, still standing by the door, looked at the CEO, then the child, sensing that there was more to the situation than met the eye. But the CEO wasn't ready to explain just yet. Not when the child was so fragile. "I think it's time we get to the bottom of this," the CEO said, his voice steady despite the weight of uncertainty in his chest. He turned to Carl. "Carl, can you give us a minute?" Carl hesitated, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Of course," he replied, before stepping out and closing the door behind him. The CEO took a deep breath and turned back to the child. "Now," he began, "I want to help you. But I need to know the truth. Why are you running away? What's really going on?" The child looked up at him, and for the first time, the walls seemed to crack. The CEO could see a flash of vulnerability in their eyes, a flicker of trust beginning to form. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The child hesitated again, biting their lip, clearly weighing their options. Then, in a voice barely audible, they said, "They're looking for me." The CEO felt a chill run down his spine. "Who is?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They," the child started, but then stopped, as if struggling with the words. "They're not good people. If they find me, they'll," the child trailed off, their body trembling, the fear palpable. The CEO's heart ached. He could feel the desperation in the child's words. Whoever these people were, they were someone the child feared deeply. Someone who had caused this small, vulnerable person to run into the streets, away from whatever dark life they were fleeing. The CEO pressed gently, but firmly. "Can you tell me who they are? I promise, I'll make sure you're safe. I can help." The child shook their head violently, as though the very thought of speaking their tormentors' names was too much to bear. "No," they whispered. "They'll come after you too." A pang of realization hit the CEO like a lightning bolt. This was bigger than he had imagined. Whoever the child was running from had connections, resources, and perhaps a reach far beyond the CEO's own comprehension. The CEO's mind raced. He had a powerful network. He was used to solving problems, navigating crises, and coming out on top. But this wasn't just about business or a public relations disaster. This was something much darker. "Okay, I understand," he said, his tone steady but filled with concern. "I'll protect you. No one's going to hurt you here." The child didn't seem fully convinced, but they nodded. The trust wasn't there yet, but it was a flicker of something the CEO hadn't seen before, a tiny glimmer of hope. He could work with that. The CEO stood up, his decision firm. "I think it's time we get some answers. I'll take you somewhere safe, somewhere these people can't find us." But just as he turned to walk toward the door, a voice stopped him cold. "I'm not safe anywhere," the child whispered, more to themselves than to him. The CEO's heart sank as he realized the depth of the fear the child felt. It wasn't just about hiding from a few bad people, it was about something much deeper. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just the child's problem anymore. It was now his problem too. And with that realization, the CEO knew that his life, his world, was about to be irrevocably changed. The mysteries surrounding the child's story were only beginning to unravel, but one thing was clear: there was far more at stake than just protecting a lost soul. The CEO stared at the child for a long moment, the weight of their words hanging heavily in the air. The child's declaration that they were not safe anywhere echoed in his mind, the implication of those words sinking deeper than he wanted to admit. The severity of the situation was beginning to settle over him, like a storm cloud that had been brewing just out of sight. There was something larger at play here, something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Without another word, he walked over to his desk and picked up his phone. He dialed Carl's number, his voice firm when he spoke. "Get in touch with our private security team. Have them set up surveillance around the office. I need to know if anyone's been following us." Carl didn't hesitate. "Understood, sir. I'll handle it." The CEO hung up the phone and turned back to the child. The look in their eyes, raw, filled with so many emotions, yet so guarded, made it clear that they didn't feel like they could trust anyone. He had seen fear before, but this was something different. This wasn't just about running from a difficult home life, this was about escaping something far more dangerous, something the child couldn't even name. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked softly, but the child shook their head quickly. "They'll know," the child whispered, their voice barely audible. "They'll find me." The CEO felt a pang of frustration. How could he help when the child was so reluctant to speak? But he couldn't afford to give up now. The stakes were too high, and he was more deeply involved than he realized. For all the power and control he had in the business world, he couldn't fix this with money or influence alone. He needed to know the truth. He walked over to the child and crouched down to their level, trying to make himself as non-threatening as possible. "I know you're scared. I can help you, but only if you let me in. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry this by yourself." The child's eyes met his, a flicker of vulnerability crossing their face. But before they could speak, a loud bang echoed from the hallway outside the office. The CEO's head snapped up, his heart racing as the sudden noise sent a rush of adrenaline through his veins. He immediately stood up, instinctively moving toward the door. He didn't wait for Carl's signal or any explanation. The tension in the air was palpable, something was wrong. The CEO opened the door just enough to peek out, but he couldn't see anyone. He motioned for the child to stay put, but the child's fear was too great. They bolted from their seat and dashed toward the corner of the office, their small hands clutching the paper so tightly it was crumpled beyond recognition. The CEO moved quickly, but before he could reach the child, there was a knock at the door. He hesitated, then slowly turned the knob and pulled it open, his heart pounding. To his surprise, standing in the doorway was a familiar face, Carl. But it wasn't Carl who had caused the CEO's pulse to race. It was the figure standing behind him. A tall man, dressed in a dark suit, his face hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. The moment the CEO laid eyes on him, something in his gut twisted. There was something about this man, something cold, something calculated. "Sir," Carl said, his voice uncharacteristically tense, "this is Agent Knight. He's with the federal government." The CEO's eyes narrowed. "Federal? What was going on?" "Is there a problem?" the CEO asked, his voice steady, though his mind was spinning. Agent Knight didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze flicked over to the child, who was still huddled in the corner of the office. The CEO could see the shift in the agent's demeanor. It wasn't just a passing glance, it was a calculated study, as though the agent were sizing up the child like a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You'll want to get her out of here," Agent Knight said finally, his tone calm, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "There's a lot more at play here than you realize." The child's eyes widened, and the CEO felt a chill run down his spine. Her. The word hung in the air, and the realization hit him like a truck. This wasn't just any child. The agent knew something the CEO didn't. Before the CEO could react, the child let out a sharp gasp and darted toward the door, but it was too late. Agent Knight had already moved to block the exit, his tall frame filling the doorway. "Move aside," the CEO commanded, stepping forward, but Agent Knight held his ground. "You don't understand," Knight said, his voice unwavering. "We're not here to hurt her. We're here to protect her. And we need to move now." The CEO's pulse quickened, confusion mixing with his rising anxiety. What was going on? Who was this child? And why had Knight called her when they had never even confirmed the child's identity? The tension in the room skyrocketed, and the child's breath came in quick gasps. She was trembling, eyes wide with panic, yet she stayed frozen in place, her tiny body no longer trying to escape. The CEO realized then that the situation was much more complicated than he had ever imagined. "I don't know what's going on here," he said, his voice steady, but with the underlying frustration that had begun to boil beneath the surface. "But I need answers." Knight studied him for a long moment, then spoke in a low, serious tone. "You have no idea who she really is, do you?" The CEO's heart skipped a beat. The agent's words lingered in the air like a chilling warning. Whatever was happening, it was just the beginning. And if the CEO didn't act fast, everything, his company, his life, and most importantly, the child's safety, could be destroyed in an instant. The room was heavy with tension. The child, still shaking, glanced up at Agent Knight, then back at the CEO, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. The CEO could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, every second seeming to stretch into eternity. The door was blocked, the child was terrified, and Agent Knight, this stranger with his calm, cold demeanor, was now claiming to be there to protect her. "Who is she?" the CEO demanded, his voice more forceful now, trying to make sense of the chaos. Agent Knight didn't immediately answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the CEO, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You need to trust me. This goes deeper than you think. But right now, there's no time to explain everything. We have to move." The CEO felt a flash of anger. Move? There was no way he was going to let a stranger dictate his actions. Not when it came to this child, this innocent being who had already been through so much. But the urgency in the agent's voice gave him pause. There was something in Knight's eyes, something urgent, that made the CEO hesitate. The agent was clearly serious, and the child was in danger. "What's going on? Who's after her?" the CEO asked, his tone softer now, more pleading. His instincts told him that there was something big at play, something he wasn't privy to yet. But for the first time, doubt crept in. Could he really protect this child on his own? Agent Knight's face was impassive, but the tension in his body was palpable. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his voice steady but edged with a dark undertone. "I can't tell you everything right now. Not yet. But I'll say this, if you want her to be safe, we need to leave immediately. There are people who have been hunting her for a long time. If they find her now, everything will be over." The CEO turned back to the child, his heart pounding in his chest. She was still frozen in place, her small body trembling as she clutched the crumpled paper. He could see the fear written across her face, but there was something else, something deeper. It was a look of someone who had been running, hiding, for far too long. "You don't have to be afraid," the CEO said softly, taking a step toward her. I'm here to help you. Whatever's going on, I'll make sure you're safe. The child looked up at him, but it wasn't trust in her eyes. It was desperation. She shook her head, her lips trembling as she spoke in a quiet voice, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be with you. They'll hurt you. The CEO felt a cold chill run down his spine. The child's words echoed the fears that had been building inside him ever since she had arrived at his office. But this was different. Whoever they weren't just any ordinary threat. This was something far more sinister. Agent Knight's patience was beginning to thin. Sir, he said, his voice now firm. We don't have time. We need to leave. Now. The CEO hesitated for a split second longer before making a decision. He could feel his heart racing, his mind spinning as he tried to piece everything together. Who was this child? And why was she so afraid? But one thing was clear, whatever was happening, it was bigger than he ever imagined. All right, the CEO said finally, his voice low but resolute. We'll leave. But I need to know where we're going. What's happening? Agent Knight stepped aside, opening the door to reveal two men in dark suits, standing guard outside the office. They looked like they belonged to a different world, a world the CEO had never known. They said nothing, but their presence spoke volumes. Without another word, the CEO motioned for the child to follow him. As they walked through the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just shifted. He had thought he could handle any business challenge, any negotiation, any crisis. But this? This was different. This was something entirely out of his control. The CEO's mind raced as they walked down the hallway. He could feel the weight of the child's gaze on him, the pressure mounting with every step. What was he getting into? What had he just agreed to? As they stepped into an elevator, the child stood silently beside him. She didn't look at him anymore, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. But he could see the fear in her body language, the way she stiffened, the way her small hands gripped the fabric of her jacket. The elevator doors closed, and the CEO felt the familiar sensation of the world closing in around him. But this time, it wasn't the pressure of a deal or the stress of the corporate world, it was the fear of something far darker, something he couldn't yet comprehend. The elevator descended, and with every passing floor, the CEO's unease grew. He had helped a child. He had made a promise to protect her. But what had he really gotten himself into? As the doors opened, they stepped into an underground parking garage. A black van sat waiting at the far end, the engine running, its tinted windows barely visible in the dim light. The men in suits motioned for them to get in. The child looked up at the van, then back at the CEO. The look in her eyes was one of resignation. She was no longer surprised. She had been through this before. And so had the CEO, though he didn't know it yet. As they climbed into the van, the doors shut behind them, and the engine roared to life. The child sat across from the CEO, her gaze fixed on the floor, lost in her own thoughts. The CEO tried to push the questions from his mind, but they only grew louder. What was this child's connection to the government? Why had she been running from someone for so long? But there was no time to ask those questions now. No time to think. The van turned onto the street, and the CEO felt the weight of his decision settle deeper into his chest. His life, his business, his future, it was all about to change. But for better or worse, there was no turning back. The van rumbled through the city streets, the hum of the engine filling the silence. The child sat across from the CEO, her small form curled inward, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she could protect her very soul from whatever danger was closing in on her. The CEO's mind raced with questions, but there was no one to answer them. He could only watch the child in the dim light, wondering who she was, why she had been running, and what kind of people would make a child fear for her life so deeply. The van made a sharp turn onto a quieter road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The CEO's eyes flicked between the child and Agent Knight, who sat silently in the seat next to him. The agent's face was an unreadable mask, his hands resting calmly on his lap. The tension in the air was palpable, thick, heavy, suffocating. The CEO couldn't hold his silence any longer. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice sharp but barely above a whisper. "What's really going on?" Agent Knight didn't turn to look at him, but the calm in his voice was unmistakable. "I told you, sir. There's no time to explain. We're taking her to a safe house where she can stay hidden until the danger passes." The CEO's mind churned. A safe house? Who's after her? What is this about? Knight's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "You don't want to know. Trust me, you're better off not knowing. All you need to know is that she's important, far more important than you realize, and there are people who will stop at nothing to get their hands on her." The CEO's heart pounded in his chest. Important? The word echoed in his mind. What did that mean? The child was just that, an innocent, vulnerable child. What made her so significant? He looked at the child again. Her face was pale, her lips trembling slightly, but she said nothing. She didn't even look at him anymore, as if the weight of whatever was happening had numbed her to the world. The CEO's stomach twisted as he thought of how many children were out there, alone and afraid, and how easily they could slip through the cracks. But this child, she was different. There was something about her that made the CEO believe that her story was far more complex, far more dangerous, than he could ever imagine. The van made another turn, and the buildings around them began to look more industrial, isolated from the bustle of the city. The CEO's unease grew as they drove deeper into the unfamiliar part of town. "Where are we going?" the CEO asked, trying to control his rising sense of dread. "What is this place?" Knight didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the child, his gaze softening just for a moment. "You're going to be safe now," he said, as if trying to reassure both the child and himself. But the child didn't respond. She just stared out the window, her eyes distant, lost in some dark memory. The van pulled up to an inconspicuous building, hidden behind a thick wall of trees. The parking lot was empty, save for a few vehicles parked in the shadows. The CEO's instincts screamed at him that something was off. This wasn't a regular safe house. There was something about this place that felt wrong. His business mind kicked into gear, analyzing every detail, trying to decipher the puzzle that was being laid out before him. The doors of the van opened, and one of the men in suits stepped forward to escort them inside. The child remained silent, her small hand clutching the crumpled paper even tighter, as if it were her only anchor to the world. As they walked into the building, the CEO's heart rate increased. It was dark inside, lit only by dim lights hanging from the ceiling. The walls were stark, utilitarian. There was no comfort here, no warmth. It was a place meant to hide, not protect. Every part of him screamed that this wasn't where the child belonged. This was no place for an innocent child to be kept hidden away. They were led down a narrow hallway to a room at the back of the building. As they entered, the CEO's eyes were drawn to a large, metal door at the far end of the room, its surface cold and uninviting. He couldn't help but notice how everything in this building felt too structured, too controlled. Knight turned to the CEO, his expression hardening. "She'll stay here. It's the safest place for her right now." The child didn't move to sit. Instead, she stood by the door, her small body tense, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and defiance. She wanted to leave. The CEO could see it in the way her fingers twitched, as though she were ready to run again. He stepped toward her. "You're safe here. I know it doesn't feel like it, but it's the only way we can protect you." She didn't answer him. She just shook her head slowly, almost as if she were resigned to the fate that had been forced upon her. The CEO turned to Agent Knight. "What happens now? What is this place?" Knight's lips pressed into a tight line. "Now we wait. We wait for things to settle. We wait for the people hunting her to move on." The CEO was about to say something else when the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. He turned just in time to see another man, tall and broad-shouldered, step into the room. The man had a look of cold efficiency about him, his eyes scanning the room quickly, assessing the situation. Knight nodded to him. "This is Agent Gray. He'll be overseeing her protection while you're here." Agent Gray didn't say anything, just gave the CEO a sharp look, as if evaluating whether he could be trusted. The tension in the room thickened, the silence stretching as they all sized each other up. The CEO couldn't shake the feeling that he was now a part of something much bigger, something that was spinning out of control. The child moved toward the corner of the room, curling up on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She seemed small and fragile, like a bird trying to hide from a storm. The CEO's heart ached for her. He couldn't understand the depth of the terror she felt, but he knew that whatever had brought her here was far from over. He had promised to protect her, but as he looked around at the men in the room, at the cold, calculating world they seemed to represent, he realized just how much he had underestimated the danger they were all facing. This child, this innocent soul, was at the center of something far darker than he could comprehend. And as he watched her tremble in the corner, he knew that the truth was out there somewhere. But finding it would come at a price. A price that none of them were ready to pay. The room was silent except for the soft sound of the child's breathing. She sat in the corner, her body hunched, her eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to disappear into the shadows. The CEO watched her closely, feeling a deep sense of helplessness. He had promised to protect her, but now, as he stood in the cold, sterile room, surrounded by agents and unanswered questions, he wasn't sure he had the power to keep that promise. Agent Knight stood near the door, his posture rigid, as though he were waiting for something. Agent Gray, too, remained silent, his watchful eyes never leaving the child. The tension in the room was palpable, an unspoken understanding that something big was coming, something that would change everything. The CEO couldn't shake the feeling that they were all caught in the eye of a storm. There was so much he didn't know, so much he couldn't understand. But one thing was clear, the child was the key. Whoever, or whatever, was hunting her had the power to shake the foundations of everything he knew. He took a step closer to the child, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, kneeling down in front of her. "You're safe here. I'll make sure of it." The child didn't look up, didn't respond. She simply hugged her knees tighter, her small body trembling. The CEO's heart sank. He had seen people in fear before, but this wasn't just fear, it was the kind of terror that came from being hunted, from knowing that there was no place left to hide. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then, something in him clicked. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. This was about understanding her, about helping her face the truth. The truth about who she was, and why she was so important. He took a deep breath and said, "I need you to trust me. I can't protect you if you don't trust me." The words hung in the air. The child didn't respond, but the CEO saw the slightest movement in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Please," the CEO continued, "I know you're scared. But I'm not going to leave you. I'm here. You don't have to run anymore. You don't have to be alone." For a long moment, the child didn't speak. The room seemed to hold its breath, the seconds stretching into eternity. And then, with a soft, almost inaudible whisper, she spoke. "My name is Evelyn." The CEO's heart stopped for a moment. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just any name, it was a name he recognized. A name that had been buried in the back of his mind for years, but had only just resurfaced in this moment. Evelyn. The CEO's thoughts flashed back to a conversation he had overheard long ago, in the quietest corner of a boardroom, one he had dismissed at the time as irrelevant. It had been about a child, a missing child, one with a legacy, a connection to powerful people, people who had everything to gain from controlling her. But why had they been after her? Why hadn't anyone told him the truth? He stared at Evelyn in disbelief, the weight of the realization crashing down on him. She wasn't just any child. She was a key player in something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The forces that were hunting her were no mere criminals, they were part of a vast network, a hidden power that controlled more than just money and influence. His breath caught in his throat as he took a step back. This wasn't just a business problem. This wasn't just about helping a lost child. This was about survival, his own survival, and the survival of everyone he cared about. As the realization hit him, Agent Knight spoke again, his voice calm but insistent. "You need to understand, sir, this is bigger than all of us. Evelyn isn't just a runaway. She's part of something that goes to the highest levels, people who would do anything to get to her." The CEO's mind reeled. He had known it was dangerous, but he hadn't known how dangerous. There was so much more to this story, so many layers he had yet to uncover. But one thing was certain, his life, and the lives of everyone he cared about, were now tied to Evelyn's fate. Evelyn slowly lifted her head, her eyes locking with the CEO's. There was a new strength in her gaze, a flicker of something he hadn't seen before. For the first time since he had met her, she seemed to trust him, not completely, but enough. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered. "But I didn't know where else to go." The CEO nodded slowly, his mind already working, analyzing the situation. He had to act, and he had to act fast. This was no longer just a matter of protecting a child. It was a matter of taking down an entire network, a network that was willing to destroy everything in its path to get what it wanted. As the realization settled into him, the weight of responsibility pressing down on his chest, the CEO made a decision. He wasn't just going to protect Evelyn. He was going to bring down the people who were hunting her. He was going to make sure they never hurt anyone again. And with that thought, he stood up, his resolve hardening. He knew this would be the hardest battle of his life. But he was ready. He had to be. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you, no one will hurt you again." The child, Evelyn, looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet hope that had been absent before. She nodded, just barely, as if she could finally believe that someone was there for her. And as the CEO turned to Agent Knight, he knew the road ahead would be filled with danger and uncertainty. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when Evelyn's life, and his own, hung in the balance.